Hello, dear students. This is the first lecture of our course. The title of the course is Cultural Studies, EN 703, and each lecture will be divided into two parts. So this is part 1 of lecture 1 of the Cultural Studies course. As you can see, the title of this lecture is Introduction and Beginnings of Discipline. In this lecture, we are going to introduce you to the definition of cultural studies. What do we mean when we say we have a course of cultural studies? And as an academic discipline, how did this course begin? Cultural studies can be considered as a relatively recent course in comparison with other courses that have been taught at our department and at corresponding departments of English language and literature in universities all over the world. There were always courses about, for example, history of literature, courses about the novel, drama, poetry, critical theory, practical criticism, culture in general, but this nomination, Cultural Studies course, is a relatively recent arrival in the world of academic disciplines. And when we mention the word recent, it doesn't mean 1 year or 2 years or 10 years even. Actually, the beginnings of cultural studies as a discipline go back to the period after the Second World War. We all know that the Second World War took place from 1939 to 1945. In the decades that followed the end of this war, which means in the 1950s, and 1960s, we have, or we can trace back the beginnings of this course as an academic discipline taught at university departments all over the world. It started in England, as we will later discuss in our lecture. The British universities were the first to adopt academic courses of cultural studies. And then later, gradually, it spread to other parts of the Western world, and then it spread all over the world. Let us begin by giving a formal definition of the academic discipline of cultural studies. Cultural studies is an academic discipline encompassing a field of theoretical, political, and empirical cultural analysis that concentrates upon different aspects of contemporary culture, such as its political dynamics, its historical foundations, its defining features, its conflicts, and its contingencies or adaptations. Now, let's explain this formal definition of the field or the discipline of cultural studies. First of all, when we describe it as an academic discipline, as we said, it means it has taken its part and its place as part of the syllabus in academic institutions, including universities and maybe high schools, and it has become an independent discipline, although of course, like any other discipline, it has close relations to other disciplines. You know that nowadays the term interdisciplinary is a key word. You can never separate completely a discipline from other disciplines. You can never study something in isolation. For example, all the courses that you as students of English literature in our department are studying, they are all interrelated. And if you excel in any of these courses, this is bound to help you while you are studying or sitting for exams in other courses. So this is like a short explanation of the term academic or academic discipline. Now, this discipline is mainly a field of cultural analysis. You are conducting cultural analysis. Now, whenever I am conducting any term of analysis, suppose somebody is conducting a scientific analysis or a historical analysis or whatever, you need to define what is the main orientation of this field of analysis. So in our case, cultural studies encompass or contain or is constituted by a field of cultural analysis, an analysis of culture, which has like three main orientations. There is the theoretical orientation, the political orientation, and the empirical orientation. The theoretical orientation means that in cultural studies, we have theorists, we have figures, intellectuals and authors who have put the main tenets of cultural theory. They have given us certain definitions with which to work when we are conducting our cultural analysis, and they have enumerated maybe a number of features or a number of procedural steps and so on that you have to follow when you are conducting cultural analysis. So this is the theoretical orientation of cultural studies. Now, the empirical orientation, at the first glance, it might seem to be a contradiction, because usually when somebody tells you, I am conducting a theoretical study, this is taken to be the opposite of conducting an empirical study. One of them is mainly a theoretical field, and the other is empirical, depending on experiments, on field work. The word empirical or experimental is like you are conducting a field work. For example, you want to study the school culture in high schools in rural areas in Egypt. So maybe you go there and you conduct a field study, and you are like doing empirical cultural analysis, having interviews and surveys with students and teachers, and writing down your results and having statistics. This would be an empirical analysis. But cultural study actually encompasses both. You need to have the theoretical orientation plus the empirical orientation. The two go together hand in hand. If you say, I am conducting a cultural analysis, then you have to combine these two orientations. There is a third orientation that you have here in the slide, which is the political orientation. Actually, you know that politics is embedded in all levels of society. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to separate politics from whatever is happening or taking place in a certain culture. So, a field like cultural studies with such a wide orientation is bound to focus also on the politics that are prevalent in a certain culture. Now, when you conduct a cultural study, and when you have these three orientations, the theoretical, the empirical, the political, what does this study concentrate upon? It concentrates upon the different aspects of the contemporary culture. You look at the culture at the present time of your study, the contemporary culture, for example, contemporary Egyptian culture, and you study its different aspects, such as, if we want to have examples about these aspects, the political dynamics. We just mentioned that politics and the concept of power, as we will see later in our course, is a very important concept in cultural studies. And in addition to studying the contemporary culture, you also need to study the historical foundations of this contemporary culture. You cannot simply say that we are studying, for example, the effect of the novel in the year 2020 on the Egyptian reading population without taking into account the historical foundations. Or you cannot say we are studying the identity of Egypt or of Egyptian society in the 21st century. Again, you cannot do this without taking into account the historical foundations of this contemporary culture. Now, when cultural studies focuses on contemporary culture and on the historical foundations of this contemporary culture, the cultural analysts or the cultural critics, they define the features or the traits of a certain culture. For example, they would say that the Egyptian contemporary culture has the following features. Number one, people are religious, or number two, people are sentimental, or number three, hard workers, or number four, whatever, okay? The features of a culture and of the people, of course, of this culture. It's a culture of work, it's a culture of cooperation, it's a culture of leisure, it's a culture of whatever, okay? And they will also describe its conflicts. For example, if a certain culture has some sort of racism, a conflict between the different races or ethnicities of the people who share the same culture, then there would be a description of the conflicts and of the contingencies. Now, let us pause a bit here and try to explain the term contingencies, whether the contingencies of the culture or its adaptations, or whether we are talking about the contingencies and adaptations of contemporary culture or the contingencies and adaptations of the historical foundations of the culture. The term contingencies, of course, always relates to the potential alternatives or the possible alternatives of any given culture. And the adaptations means the ways in which the culture changes or adapts in order to encompass or to contain elements that were not an integral part of it at the beginning. So let us give an example of our contemporary Egyptian culture, our contemporary culture in Egypt, to explain what were the possible alternatives and how did these alternatives settle and adapt in order to, as an illustrative example, in other words, as an illustrative example of what is meant by the contingencies and adaptations of a culture, whether the contemporary one or the historical foundations upon which this contemporary culture is built. Let us take an example, as we were saying, about the Egyptian culture or the contemporary culture in Egypt. For example, if we see our identity nowadays, we can say that it's a sort of multiple identity. Like we are so many things at the same time. We have our Pharaonic identity, we have our Coptic identity, our Arab identity, our Islamic identity, also our African identity as part of the continent of Africa, our Middle Eastern identity as part of this region called the Middle East. And each of these identities was prevalent at one time in our history. But sometimes there were certain conflicts, sometimes there were certain alliances, and there were factors that led to the emergence of our contemporary identity, which is not a single one. In other words, it isn't that the Arab identity per se has conquered all the others and has led them to disappear. Or we cannot say that the Pharaonic one did that or the Middle Eastern one did that. It is simply that there were certain adaptations, certain resolution of conflicts that happened, certain alternatives that were taken together because of a number of factors that led our current identity to be a multiple one. So if you are conducting a cultural study or if you are a cultural critic and you are reading a work of literature, let us go back to literature, because we always say that our courses serve and help each other. So if I am studying a course of cultural studies and I am a student at the Department of English Language and Literature, I would expect this course to be helping me with my other courses. And this is exactly what we are saying. You can consider that cultural studies, with the many theories that you are going to meet during the course, you can consider it as part of your critical framework that you can use when you are analyzing any work of literature. For example, if you are analyzing a novel text, whether a novel written by an Arab author or a Western novel that takes Egypt as the setting of the events of the novel, or whatever, you can choose to conduct a cultural analysis. And in this case, all the theoretical information or bases or foundations that you are getting in this course, the certain definitions and methods and so on, they can help you to conduct your cultural analysis of a novel, a play, or a poem, as the case might be. Now let's move to the other part of the lecture, or another slide. Now, the researchers of cultural studies, those that we usually call them cultural critics, investigate how different cultural practices are related to wider systems of power that operate through social phenomena such as ideology, class structure, gender, race, ethnicity, national formations, and generations. Actually, this is again more explanation of what the cultural critics do. What do they have to investigate in their field of study? You have these critics investigating the relations between two entities. The first entity is the cultural practices, and the second entity is the wider systems of power. And we use the word wider because the cultural practices themselves are parts of these systems of power. So they study the relation between the cultural practices and between the wider systems of power that surround them. Of course, the cultural practices would refer to whatever practice is being done by the people who belong to a certain culture. Their lifestyle, their cooking habits, their religious rituals or ceremonies, their family composition, whatever, their thoughts, their beliefs, their values, everything is part of this cultural practice. Now, these cultural practices are related to the wider systems of power that can include so many things, like the government and all the institutions that we have, institutions of religion, of education, of media, of entertainment and leisure, institutions of work, labor, institutions of politics. Everything about it is part of this. How are these related? How are the practices related to the wider systems of power? They are related through certain links. Some of the links do not require much explanation, such as the class structure, how any given society is divided into classes, and the gender, male, female, the women and men in a certain society and the relation between them, race or ethnicity, in cases of multiracial or multi-ethnic societies, the relations between these, the national formations, because again, some cultures or societies have more than a national formation, and the different generations, the different age groups that co-live or coexist or have this cohabitation in the same culture or society. So if these things are studied, they are the link between the practices and the systems of power. And some of these links, such as the link of ideology in particular, is going to be examined in fuller details in other lectures of the same course. So for now, we have finished this part of your lecture. Let us see again that we have a point about cultures being not fixed, not stable, not limited or bounded or discrete. Cultures are all the time continuously interacting and changing. For example, if we talk about certain cultural practices in a given culture at a given moment, these practices, they do not have to be fixed across time. They would change. They have been something and they would evolve into something else and so on. And in general, the field of cultural studies is not like separate from other fields. It is closely linked, although it is not the same or identical as other academic disciplines, and in particular, cultural anthropology as a discipline and ethnic studies as another discipline. These two disciplines are closely linked to cultural studies. You may come across them as you read your material or so on, but we are not going to delve into details about these two distinct, although linked disciplines to cultural studies. The first part of Lecture 1 has finished. Thank you for being attentive, and we are going to continue this lecture in a second part. Good luck.